Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale T26E4 Pershing tank. Unlike many of the other smaller scale builds which are posted on my video listings and channel, in which many of those builds are built for private commission and belong to a private collector, the build that you see here was built for my own collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I often take on commission build projects from vehicles ranging from 1/35th scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. As for availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. Now, the model that you see here is built mostly out of the box, however, does feature a few add-ons and mods which were made to the model. All of these additions will be discussed in this video. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around the model. And this vehicle here is the T26E4 Pershing. This vehicle really has a connection to the T26E3 Pershing, which was developed and was fielded in the latter half of the war. The T26E3 was a decent tank design. However, the one problem that it had was that the 90mm main gun was still not going to be viable for dealing with the new generation German tanks which were just being fielded. These vehicles, of course, would be the King Tiger as well as the Jag Tiger. The solution for this problem was to bump up the velocity of the 90mm gun, and this gun here was the T15E2. This gun here used 2-piece ammunition and had a higher muzzle velocity compared to the standard 90mm guns which were found on the production M26 or T26E3 Pershings. A few pilot models were developed, and the first generation ones featured large recuperators which were mounted on top of the turret in order to counterbalance that of the extremely long gun barrel that is found on the new gun. In addition to the external springs, a large counterweight was welded to the back portion of the rear bustle, again to aid with the turret's performance with the longer gun. One of these pilot models was actually sent and saw combat at the tail end of World War II. This vehicle, when it entered into the field, was heavily up-armored by the crew in field, using as many parts from scrap tanks as well as even scrap German tanks in order to give the tank a little bit more armor. This vehicle actually is credited for knocking out a King Tiger in one of the final tail-end battles of the war. While the pilot model was seeing combat overseas, research and development was still being done to the Super Pershing series stateside. Some of the breakthroughs in the design were that the large recuperator springs, which were a feature on the pilot models, were no longer necessary due to the change in the stabilization design inside the turret. This vehicle in this configuration actually went into limited production, and about 25 units were produced until the end of the war brought the end of the project. Of the actual production vehicles, one vehicle is known to survive and is currently on display in a military museum in the United States. Outside of the extra long gun and the counterweight, the vehicle automotively is basically the same as your standard T26E3. It used the same engine, the same gearbox, and had the same off-road and on-road performance. The tank's armor thickness also stayed the same as well. In addition to the armor outside of the main gun, the other secondary armament was also exactly unchanged. This would include the tank being equipped with two M1919A4 machine guns, one in the hull and the second in the coaxial position. And of course, being an American tank, on top of the turret is adorned with an M2 HB 50 caliber machine gun. Outside of the one pilot model to see combat in World War II, none of the Super Pershing T26E4 tanks ever saw combat in Korea or any other conflicts during that time. Before I continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit came with. And here's the model just before the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/35th scale T26E4 Super Pershing kit from Tamiya. This kit here is a relatively recent release from Tamiya. It came out in around the 2011 timeframe. However, the majority of the kit components themselves are heavily based on the earlier release, the T26E3 kit, which Tamiya released back in 2002. This model here was a bit of a no-brainer for Tamiya to produce, as it doesn't really require a whole bunch of new tooling in order to make a different version of the Pershing. This version of the Pershing differs from the earlier incarnation in that it has a longer barreled gun, as well as a counterweight which is added to the rear bin. Other than that, the kit is exactly the same as the other version. The model that you see here was acquired off of Amazon.com and was purchased about 6 months ago, and does have a little bit of shop dust on it. Being a relatively recent release, these kits here are not very difficult to acquire and can be found fairly easily. These kits can be found on many of the online retailers, as well as places like Amazon, which is where I got this one, as well as on eBay. As for pricing, these kits retail anywhere from about $32 to approximately $50 US. Getting on to the review of the model, starting with the box art. The box art is your typical Tamiya white background type display, with that of a very well illustrated rendition of the T26E4, as well as a squad of US soldiers, which are supplied with this kit. Continuing with the graphic design, takes us to the side panel, which has a profile shot of some of the markings, which is all standard for Tamiya, as well as a little brief history, which is written in Japanese, of this version of the vehicle, as well as the photograph, which is found in the Tamiya catalog. Cracking open the box will reveal its contents. Now, unlike many of the other contemporary manufacturers like Dragon or Meng, in which the kits are supplied with photo etch as well as aluminum barrels, none of those type of details are found with this kit here. However, this kit here, like I said, is an all plastic model, but just like all the other Tamiya kits that were released, assemble very easily, and the molding and detailing is quite decent for the type of tooling. Starting with the parts, this here is one of the components that separates this tank as a T26E4. It's that of the gun barrel, the counterweight, as well as the elongated travel lock. Moving on, takes us to the tank commander, as well as some US AFV accessories. For anyone who has built the 1/16 scale version of the Tamiya Pershing, this runner here will look exactly like Deja Vu, as it's the exact same type of layout with the way the parts are oriented and broken down. Here goes a runner of the soldiers, as well as their weapons. Weapons are pretty decent for the tooling, and if anyone's a figure modeler, should be able to assemble these guys without a whole lot of effort. Now here goes the parts of the actual tank itself. This runner here is directly from the T26E3, which was released about 10 years ago. And the detail is, in my opinion, very adequate for this type of media. The mantle does have some cast texturing, which is a nice feature, and it's one that we've come to expect on more contemporary model kits. Moving on to the row wheels. Here's the upper hull and the turret, which is basically a scaled down version of the 1/16 scale version, with the exact same type of detailing, no less. This here's the lower hull, as well as the runner for the M2 HB50 caliber machine gun. This looks like a general release type runner. As I could see, it's got some parts that would be for a soft skin vehicle mount ring, which is more likely lifted from their deuce and a half truck, which obviously the ring components are not going to be used on this vehicle here. We have here a runner full of polycaps as well as springs. Springs is an interesting feature as this tank does have a somewhat workable suspension, more of which I'll go into detail in the upcoming scenes. This is obviously the tank's track. Being a Tamiya kit, it has one-piece vinyl type track. The tracks themselves have nice detail present for the media that they are represented in, and will be used on this model. Of course, we have the tank's instructions, which look very reminiscent to 1970s Nichimo type instruction sheets with the green coloring, but that's a story for another day. And just like typical Tamiya instructions, looks to be very well illustrated and very thorough with the build. Shouldn't be any surprises with these instructions here. This here is just a quick backstory about the T26E4 project, and contains many illustrations which were lifted from the 116. Starting with the model suspension, the suspension that is on this tank is the same suspension which is found on the other Tamiya T26E4 Pershing. No surprise. The kit, like I mentioned in the unboxing, does have the ability to be modeled with that of a semi-working suspension. What I mean by that is that the first and the last torsion bar on each side are controlled and have a spring built in which allow them to return. And the wheels in the center are held on via polycaps and are movable, but they are not returnable, so that they are form-fitting. The idea behind this system is you have two fasteners mounted on the inside of the tank, and when you take the tank and put it on a diorama, you're actually supposed to bolt the tank to the diorama. And when it gets bolted to the diorama, the downward force of the fasteners will articulate the suspension. The suspension arms in the center will just simply contour with the terrain that it's placed on, and the two on the front and the rear will give resistance, thus preventing the tank from sagging. Now, this suspension was assembled as per the kit instructions, and my takeaway from the suspension is the following. Yeah, the suspension, it sucks. There's no other way around it. Some of the problems that incurred with the tank suspension, well, first, the two big ones. The springs, which hold the wheels together and hold them up, are bolted into the tank via two small micro fasteners. Very similar in the way that it's found on the Tamiya 116 scale tank. So you would think that it would be, pretty robust, as the 116 versions do hold up pretty well. The problem is I found on this version of the tank was that the pieces were assembled and I had the suspension working. However, during the course of the build, and mind you, this is a static model, so I'm not exactly test driving it, the pieces that were bolted into the tank literally just cracked off at the bases and and when this happens, you can't salvage them. So the springs literally were useless. The suspension arms were glued permanently in their place to the way you see it here, as this tank, it's not being placed on a diorama, so the functional suspension is not really necessary. In addition to that, I also found the concept with the wheels in the center where they're form-fitting but they don't have any return to be completely useless. When you are building the tank and you're maneuvering the track and putting everything on, these wheels here will be a nightmare trying to get them all to line up properly. So much so that if anyone has this tank, I wouldn't be surprised that when it comes time to photography, you're going to see these wheels bouncing around all over the place just from the simple maneuvering and handling of the model. Now, for the diorama use, possibly it might be okay. However, another thing to keep in mind is with the type of track. This tank does have a rubber track with it. And with this vinyl track kind of has a memory to it and is not very flexible in terms of dealing with contours and keeping the contours still. For if you were building this tank and you wanted to really take advantage of the workable suspension, it would be best by swapping out the vinyl track with that of workable track links. The metal workable track links, or even plastic workable track links for that matter, will give you a better articulation and more friendly for that of a diorama base. However, with the stock kit, I don't think so. Now, in case anyone has this kit in their stash and they want to glue the wheels and forego the working suspension, not all is lost, as the kit does have the capability of having the pieces glued on static. There are actually small little nubs that are integrally molded onto the swing arms, as well as receptors molded into the hull, in which it's like your standard 1/35 scale model. You just add the glue and insert the piece. In fact, to make the piece functional, Tamiya requests that you delete and cut off these little tabs. So if you leave the tabs on, you could simply just mount the suspension as is and forego the whole working process. This is kind of interesting, as we've seen something very similar in my videos with this type of working suspension on a 1/35 scale tank. If my fans are out there, they're probably blurting out at the computer screen right now the initial production Dragon Tiger 1. Similar issue with similar problems were had on that build as well, and it wound up just like with this tank here, with having the swing arms permanently glued in the base state that you see here. As for the detail portion of the suspension, the pieces are nicely molded and are nicely detailed out of the box, which is standard for the type of tooling one would expect from a Tamiya kit. The detailing is also matched by the ease of which the parts go together. Again, it's a Tamiya. The piece is just, you could rattle the box and everything just kind of fits into each other. Moving to the sprocket. The sprocket's unique in that the way it assembles by Tamiya, it's comprised out of a few different components. When everything mounts together, they have the appropriate mud slits, which are typically missing on most kits. This is a nicely done feature found on the Tamiya. And at first you think that, well, it's probably complicated to put all these pieces together. Again, it's a Tamiya, and it all just comes together with very little effort. Now, what's unique about the sprockets is that on the interior portion, they have the little hex molded in. If anyone has built Tamiya tanks before, they'll tell you that that little hex is designed for that of mounting on a gearbox to have the model motorized, or in some cases radio controlled. This model here, it's incapable of having that feature. Well, more than likely what that is was that Tamiya built that capability in for a possible variant to be released in the future with a motorized option. However, as far as I know, nothing of that sort has been currently released. Moving from the sprocket takes us to the tank's track. The track you see here is the kit supply one, and like what was shown in the unboxing, is the single length one-piece vinyl track. The vinyl track is the type of medium that I personally enjoy building on these 1/35 scale tanks, and for a simple build like this is perfectly adequate for my needs. The track's detailing is nicely rendered for the type of medium that is represented, and the track went together without any hiccups. As for the pattern of track, it is the single pin all steel track link. These are the track links which are found on the T26E3, and it's important to point out that the real sole example of the T26E4 that's still around today, that vehicle utilizes the double chevron rubberized version of the Pershing track. Now, it's not an inaccuracy, as I've seen period photographs of this tank being tested at Aberdeen, and it had this pattern of track present. From the track takes us to the rear hull detailing. All of the detailing you see here is stock Tamiya and came with the kit. It was simply just painted and added. Just one thing to point out is that with the taillights, of course, the one on the left-hand side is painted red with the lens, while the one on the opposite side is blacked out. This is true for all World War II pattern of American tanks. Another addition that I made was that of the little wire which comes out of the telephone box and enters into the tank. If I could get it into frame, there we go. This little piece of detailing is absent on the Tamiya kit and was a simple addition. To add it, I simply drilled a hole into the side of the tank as well as into the bottom of the telephone box. The wire itself was just fabricated out of a piece of thin floor wire, which is bent to shape, installed, and painted. It's a very simple mod to do, and one that also gives the tank a little bit more of a popping feature. Moving up from the telephone box takes us to the exhaust and the travel lock. Now, of course, this tank being a T26E4, the travel lock that's found on this tank is this very unique version that we have here, which it looks like the same basic design as the one found on most of the Pershings, however has these really long legs which extended from the bottom base. Also, on the Super Pershing, this component is actually mounted to the rear top deck as opposed to the side or to the exhaust manifold itself, which is found on the T26E3 as well as on the M26 Pershing. Now, One mod that I made to the exhaust was that because of the way the kit is designed, with having the T26E3 pattern of travel lock, which connects directly to the sides here, the Tamiya kit will have 2 holes present in the exhaust manifold when building this version of the kit. To make the vehicle a little bit more accurate, I went ahead and plugged up these holes with the bodywork, and then everything was then glazed over with cast texturing, which was absent on the stock piece. The stock piece is nicely rendered, has a nice shape to it, but is a little light on the casting texture department. So the cast texturing was added, and then the weathering and painting was brought up to the way you see it here in the video. Moving our way to the front hull detailing first takes us to the bow headlights. Now, just like on all of my World War II AFV builds, I always mount on the little canister which is found on the headlight brush guards. Now, it is important to point out that when modeling a Pershing, the headlight canisters are mounted differently than on other tanks, like say a Sherman, in which a Sherman has these canisters, but they're mounted on the outside portion of the brush guard. For the Pershing, it's actually mounted on the inside. It's one of the only World War II tanks to have this feature found in this location, and it's important to point out because if you mount on the outside, you're going to be incorrect. Moving on from the canisters takes us to the bow headlights themselves. Now, the headlights are the kit supply ones and are nicely rendered. One feature that the kit has is that the headlights are separate from the lens. Now, the lens that the kit gives you is made from opaque plastic, like which is seen on many model kits. However, since the piece is hollow, it made it really convenient for me to replace the opaque lens, which came with the kit, and replace it with clear epoxy. With the clear epoxy added, it really kicks the headlights up to another notch. Moving from the headlights takes us to the bow M1919A4 machine gun. This is stock with the kit. The one mod that I made was I drilled out the muzzle end of the machine gun, as this is like typical on many smaller scale builds, molded flat. Now, what's unique about the Tamiya kit is that the bow machine gun is actually able to pivot, which is a nice feature, and that's left stock. Moving up from the bow hull takes us to the rest of the top deck detailing, which is nothing really to report on, as everything is built out of the box and the stock. The kit itself was actually remarkably very simple. One area to point out, though, is that of the fire extinguisher cluster. Now, on this tank here, this build, I went ahead and put a red slash indicating the fire extinguisher handle. Now, what's important to point out is that on the M26 Pershing family, the fire extinguisher box was the same version found on the M5 Stuart as opposed to the one found on the Sherman. The reason why this is significant is that on the Stuart only featured one fire control handle, while on the Sherman there are 2. And if anyone is building or modifying one of these kits to make them more detailed, you don't want to use the 2-handled version from a Sherman, as it would be inaccurate. So one simple red swipe is really all you need for something rendered in this tiny scale. In addition to the fire extinguisher, another mod that was made to the sides of the hull were that on the fenders. If you notice on this model here, I didn't build it with the side skirts. With the side skirts missing on this tank, you will need to add the little holes which are found for mounting on the side skirts on the real tank. The side skirts are of course mounted on with that of a number of small little fasteners. On the tank here, the holes were made with that of a Dremel with a very small drill bit. Now, this is another procedure that really needs to be done by someone who's very skilled and who has a lot of experience, as well as the tooling, as it is very easily done where you could mess up these holes, to which then you better have your side skirts ready to go because there's no other real way to fix it. The holes on the fenders were done to both sides of the model and are a mirror image. This is again another way to really kick the model up to another notch. Another quick tip to point out is that of the weathering and with that of the filler caps. The Pershing family uses 3 filler caps, 2 on the top deck and 1 in the center. The one in the center is labeled for water, which is what I have here, while these 2 here would actually be for gasoline. Now, this matters with the way it's weathered. You don't want to put any soot or grime in this section here, as water generally just dries up nice and clear, while gasoline, if you spill it, it's just a magnet for dirt and gets messy very quickly. So it is something to keep in mind when weathering one of these models. Moving up from the hull takes us directly to the turret. Now, the turret detailing is all stock Tamiya with a few little mods here or there. Starting with the engine hoists, which are found on the sides of the turret. Just like with, I mentioned on the 116 Pershing builds, one quick mod to do is to drill out the holes found on each of these sections here. They are absent on the kit, and with a simple drill bit, you can go ahead and improve the accuracy of the build with not a whole lot of effort. The rest of the turret is basically stock for a T26E3 with the exception of the rear bustle. The rear bustle has this large counterweight added due to counterweight the balance of that very long gun, which we'll be getting to shortly. Now the piece is all stock, there's nothing really to report on, but one mod that I went ahead and did was the addition of the well bead, which is found here where the bustle counterweight meets the bustle of the tank. When you build these kits, you're going to have a seam located in this section here, and adding the well bead kills two birds with one stone. You delete the seam, as well as add the appropriate detailing, which would have been missing otherwise. Moving our way to the tank's gun, which is probably the signature piece of detailing on the entire tank. The gun's barrel is, as you can see, insanely long, which it's no joke. It's really, really long. I mean, this is like cartoonish if you see it in person. The barrel and the muzzle brake are purely stock. There was nothing really needed to be made to them. The pieces went together well. Now, they're both half joint type assemblies, which means you will have to contend with seams, which if you've built a number of models before, removing of seams is basically second nature. Once the seams were polished away, the pieces were simply mounted, and again, no problems, and were a simple installation. Moving towards the rest of the tank's turret detailing, all the components you see here again are supplied with the kit. One feature I like is that they give you the searchlight and is mounted in the downward position, which is nice, and in fact is something that should have been given with the 1/16 scale Pershing kit, but that's another story. The rangefinder is also nicely detailed for the scale that it's represented in. Now, one portion of the turret detailing that I really like that Tamiya gave you is that of the antenna bases. The antenna bases that come with a kit are the following versions. You have the standard American MP48 and you have the MP65. The details that are presently molded on them are also nicely done for, again, the scale that they're found in. The tooling is pretty crisp. Now, when it comes to painting the antenna bases, like I often mention in these builds, the antenna bases are one of the biggest focal points on an American tank, and it's number one piece that most builders actually drop the ball on, and it's something that's very simple to paint. When it comes to the antenna bases on the American MP48, the center portion here is actually made of a amber porcelain. This would be the portion that is ribbed. When you paint this piece with porcelain color and you make it shiny and put a little sheen on it, it really makes the piece pop and really makes the kit stand out from just leaving it all olive drab. As for the MP65, it's the same color used for the amber, and I use the same type of glossing agent for making it shine the way you see it here. Now on the MP65, the bottom portion here would be made out of porcelain, the middle section is actually a flexible rubber, and the top portion would be made out of metal, and that's the part where the antenna would actually plug into. Now you can't make the antenna plug into this vehicle here simply due to the small scale, and this is common for MP65s represented in other kits that I've built in the past. However, it's not inaccurate to have the MP65 antennaless, as this is commonly done. As for the antenna wire itself, this is just a piece of floor wire which simply gets glued to the stock piece. Tamiya goes ahead and molds a little notch into their MP48, which is small enough to get covered up by the super glue when it comes for the addition of the wire. Now, if you notice on the wire itself, I painted black, which I typically do, and on the bottom and top portion of the real antenna bases, there are two small knurled tips that used to plug into each other. On the bottom, it's blue, and on the top, it's red, which is commonly seen on my builds. Moving our way to the M2HB 50 caliber machine gun. The gun that you see here is a stock Tamiya unit. The Tamiya one is a decent gun for what it is. However, it is not nearly as advanced or as super detailed as the ones that come with other more modern kits that are on the market, such as AFV Club or Dragon. However, the 50 caliber that the Tamiya kit does have is, again, fairly adequate for, again, the type of build that you see here. One thing I like about the 50 is that it has the decal information for that of the 50 caliber ammo box, and it even has, you could say, the correct font which is found on these ammo cans. As for the gun itself, it's represented that in an M23 cradle, which is standard, and this 50 caliber is supplied with just about all of the American tanks which are made by Tamiya. As for any mods, the only real mod that I went ahead and did was to the muzzle end. I went ahead and drilled it out, just like with the 30. It is stock with the piece molded solid. Now, I have to warn with anyone who's attempting to drill out gun barrels on this model this small in scale, it's the type of thing that it should only be done by someone who has a lot of experience, a steady hand, and an extremely small Dremel bit. As the caution is that these pieces are so small that there's zero room for error. If you screw up with the Dremel, you will literally destroy the barrel of either the 30 or the 50. And in that case, it's better to leave it stock than to have something with a botched up barrel. And in that case, then you're pretty much stuck to trying to acquire an aftermarket 50 either in resin or from another source. So again, it's only for something that should be done by a very experienced person. Another modification that I made to the 50 was that of the ability for having it rotate. Now, if I would have followed the stock kit and built the tank truly out of the box, the gun would stay in the straight line that you see here and would not be able to rotate. It can still go up and down, but it just can't spin. The reason for that is that the yoke portion of the M23 cradle is integrally molded into the pintle mount out of the box, which is an interesting feature that Tamiya did it this route, as on the 50 caliber runner, it has the yoke portion for the M23 present. In fact, it's a spare part that you don't use. To make the piece pivot like the way I've done it here, what I did was I removed the yoke from the pintle. This was done very carefully with an X-Acto saw, and I drilled out the pintle mount with a Dremel, and I drilled out the bottom portion of the yoke with another bit. I installed a small little wire brad, and what that does, that allows the piece to be mounted and to pivot the way you see here. Now, in case anyone is attempting this, first, again, this is something that is really something that should be done by a experienced person, as again, you could screw it up and ruin the pintle mount. In case you break the yoke during this procedure, again, you have the backup one found on the runner, so you do have a little bit of leeway. But again, this is something that needs to be done with someone who's more experienced. Once it is done, however, it does have the gun be able to be mounted in a more unique way compared to just straight and standard like the way you see it stock with the kit. This is also true, by the way, for the Tamiya T26E4 Pershing as well. Moving on to paint and markings. The paint that you see here, I went ahead and used the darker shade of olive drab, which I've used on a few other builds before. The reason why I went with the darker shade of olive drab, as this is a very late war period vehicle, from 1945 to probably even post-war for that matter. And is at this point here is when the U.S. Army started to change from their olive drab, which was used during the war, to a more darker shade. This would be the type of shade that you would see more on vehicles that would be during the Korean War and into the 1950s time period. As for the markings are the stock Tamiya decals and applied literally effortlessly with no issues whatsoever. The decals were applied and they were lacquered in place, and in this case here have zero issues really to report on. The decals are very sparse on this kit, so there really isn't any room for error, but for the vehicle that's representing, there weren't exactly a whole lot of markings to be found, as again, this vehicle never really left the testing phase. As for a skill level and recommendation, this kit here I can recommend to a beginner. Literally almost anyone I think can build this kit, from a beginner all the way up to an advanced, and even of course the intermediates in between. The kit features a lot of easily assembled components that go together very quickly. There's not a whole lot of small parts to worry about, and if you pay attention and be careful with the smaller parts, you should be able to make it through pretty easily, which is again part and parcel with the tank being a Tamiya, and of course Tamiya kits are renowned for their simplicity and ease of construction. Now, a beginner, like I said, can't possibly tackle it, with the caveat that this kit does feature some small components which do need care in assembly. So as a first kit for a novice builder, I don't necessarily recommend. Something like the Tamiya M41 Walker Bulldog would probably be a better bet, and then something like this would be a nice model to level up to, as like maybe your second or third build. Other than that and some of the other tips and tricks that I mentioned in this video and places to watch out for, again, I think a beginner should be able to fare pretty well. As for the type of people who would be interested in this kit and vehicle type is great for someone who is a fan of World War II American armor in general, and also someone who's a fan of the Patton series, as this tank here was neglected for a while and is another missing link out of the way in the evolution of the Patton series. This kit here works great with the T26E4 from Tamiya, and it's a great way to round off the set. The kit also works great with the other versions of the M26 family, which were released by Dragon. Now, it's also important to point out that there are several other versions of the T26E4 Super Pershing that have been released in 1/35 scale and in plastic. Those kits were released at around the same time as this guy and are made by the company Hobby Boss. Now, it's important to point out that the Hobby Boss kits are arguably more detailed than the Tamiya offering. However, with that detail also comes with more complexity, so it is definitely something that would be better suited for a medium and advanced builder. But it is something that's on the market and is something to be aware of. Overall, I'm really happy the way the model turned out. The kit itself was an insanely blistering quick build. In fact, I had this guy built, painted, weathered, and finished in probably about 3 days, which is pretty amazing considering my really busy schedule. Now, this build here will be going into the collection, and after I build the other Tamiya T26E4 that I have in my stash, it will be interesting to line them up with the other Pershing and Patton families that I have in 1/35 scale, which more than likely will be the subject for an upcoming ECA video. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Until then, this guy is done, and I'm really off to the next build. And that concludes this model showcase video for this 1/35 scale T26E4 Pershing. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, where there are a lot more photographs in high res of this exact same model posted, as well as many of the other smaller scale builds which have been built and posted on my channel throughout the years. Also, don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.